Hello everybody, and either welcome or welcome back to my podcast. As always, I'd like to remind everybody, if you do like this, please rate, comment, and subscribe. You can find me on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Spotify. Okay, so you see the title of this week's episode. You can pretty much figure out what this is going to be about, which is the left's new favorite thing, intersectionality. And yes, this is inspired by the now somewhat infamous New York Times white guilt write-in advice column piece, which we will discuss later on in the episode. But I wanted to start in something of a happier place on this discussion, and kind of want to start off with discussing what exactly intersectionality is, or what at least it's supposed to be, and kind of the concept of where it came from, how it was originally applied, how it's kind of being applied now. And there's a piece that I want to start with before I get to that New York Times white guilt piece, about kind of the perils and dangers of using intersectionality to label people and to think that somehow through intersectionality, through labeling people, that you can know somebody. So let's go ahead and start with the description and definition from our friends at Wikipedia of what intersectionality is. Intersectionality is an analytic framework which attempts to identify how interlocking systems of power impact those who are most marginalized in society. Intersectionality considers that various forms of social stratification, such as class, race, sexual orientation, age, disability, and gender, do not exist separately from each other, but are interwoven together. While the theory began as an exploration of the oppression of women of color within society, today the analysis is potentially applied to all social categories, including social identities usually seen as dominant when considered independently. And now for kind of the TLDR on the backstory of intersectionality, it came out of second wave feminism, where there was this acknowledgement that feminism up until that point, and really, if we're being completely honest, since that point, has really centered around white, straight, upper middle class to upper class women. And the idea of intersectionality was introduced in a way to explain that the situations, the problems that black women face are not the same as what white women face. And to go even further than that, to say that the problems that lesbian women face, or black lesbian women who are born into poverty, face situations that the normal quote-unquote feminist, the upper middle class, upper class white woman does not experience, and that those experiences are also valid and also do need to be addressed in the context of feminism. And so instead of taking a step back and thinking, wow, these people have a point, maybe we should view everybody's story as individual, equally valid, but as individual stories where people may have experiences that you don't have because of situations that they're born into. Instead of just taking a step back and viewing people as individuals, we decided to come up with intersectionality, which is this hierarchy of labeling people as being, starting with your race and then going to your gender, going to your sexuality, going to your socioeconomic status, going towards whether you have a disability, so on and so forth. And like I said, the concept in and of itself isn't a bad one, especially within the framework of trying to address different situations in feminism for women and of color and of different sexual orientations. But it's kind of become this very large thing where everybody outside the feminist movement are getting these labels put on them. And it's getting to the point where these labels are getting weaponized and used against people. And obviously the most obvious example are white heterosexual males. But these labels, it's starting to be like calling somebody that is an insult to these people. To call somebody a cis white male is like the worst thing you could possibly fucking call somebody in their view. And so it's being used in that way to insult people and also to denigrate people and their opinions, that as a white person or as a straight person or as an able-bodied person or whatever new-ist thing that they come up with next week, that somehow if these labels apply to you, that your opinions and your thoughts are less than somebody who is of color or is of a different sexual orientation or is of a different socioeconomic status, or is of a different ability body-wise. And that's really, I don't think that's what was initially meant by intersectionality, but that's where we're at now, where we're starting to weaponize these sorts of labels that we put on people. And so that's kind of where I want to leave off with that. I want to go ahead and move over to the first New York Times piece I want to talk about, by an author, and I'm probably going to butcher his name. I'm sorry, but it's Kwame Anthony Appiah. And I'm not going to read the whole piece, but I do want to pull out certain sections of it because I want to discuss this idea that these labels are not very helpful in identifying anything about a person, really, before we move on to the white guilt piece. And as always, links to everything will be in the show notes, but the piece starts out like this. As a white man, Joe begins, prefacing an insight, revelation, objection, or confirmation he's eager to share. But let's stop him right there. Aside from the fact that he's white and a man, what's his point? What does it signify when people use this now ubiquitous formula, as such and such I, to affix an identity to an observation? Typically, it's an assertion of authority. As a member of this or that social group, I have experiences that lend my remarks special weight. The experiences being representative of that group might even qualify me to represent that group. Occasionally, the formula is an avowal of humility. It can be both at once. As a working-class woman, I struggle to understand Virginia Woolf's Blythe's assumption of privilege. The incantation seems indispensable, but it can also be, to use another much-loved formula, problematic. The as-a concept is an inherent feature of identities. For a group label like white men to qualify as a social identity, there must be times when the group to whom it applies acts as members of that group and are treated as members of that group. We make lives as men and women, as blacks and whites, as teachers and musicians. Yet the very word identity points towards the trouble. It comes from the Latin idem, meaning the same. Because members of a given identity group have experiences that depend on a host of other social factors, they're not the same. Which that is my point exactly. Nobody can speak for any one group of people based on labels like race or gender or sexuality or anything like that, because I can't say I speak for all straight white women because I don't know all straight white women. I've not had every experience that every other straight white woman has had. So that's kind of where we start with this idea that going down this road of labeling people and kind of trying to figure out who somebody is, who their identity is off of these labels is problematic. And to that point, we're going to skip ahead a little bit in the piece here. Let's go back to Joe with his NPR mug and his man bun. Or are you picturing a Make America Great Again tank top and a high and tight? Again, if you say straight white male, not everybody's going to have the same image pop into their head. That's going to be something that's going to be dependent on where you are in this country or even in this world. Like if you ask somebody in Japan to describe a straight white male, it's probably going to be a lot different than what you would conjure up in your head if you live in the South versus in the Midwest versus the Northeast versus the West Coast. So again, this idea that you can just throw out a label and that everybody will immediately have that same frame of reference really makes no sense. Moving on. Having an identity doesn't by itself authorize you to speak on behalf of everybody of that identity. So it can't really be that he's speaking for all white men. But he can at least speak to what it's like to live as a white man, right? Not if we take the point about intersectionality. If Joe had grown up in Northern Ireland as a gay white Catholic man, his experiences might be rather different from his gay white Protestant male friends there, let alone those of his childhood pen pal, a straight Cincinnati-raised Reformed Jew. While identity affects your experiences, there's no guarantee that what you've learned from them is going to be the same as what every other person of the same identity has learned. Again, see, even under the auspice of straight white male, or even if you went with gay white male, there's a very, very wide amount of experiences that can be encompassed by those three labels that really bear no resemblance to each other. You have to go a little deeper than that to really identify who somebody is. The piece goes on to talk a little bit about a couple of different comedians, specifically it's like Chris Rock and W. Kamau Bell. But the idea of using as is as like a signifier to kind of flesh out who you are as a human being. Like when you're speaking on something, you're speaking like as a black man or as a dad or as a rich man. And that there is kind of value to that because you can add to your personality in that way. And you can kind of explain to people that you do have different facets of your personality. But going back to the piece. But caveat auditor, let the listener beware. Representing an identity is usually volunteer work, but sometimes the representative is conjured into being. Years ago, a slightly dotty countess I knew in the Hampstead area of London used to point out a leather-jacketed man on a park bench and inform her companions with a knowing look, "He's the head gay." She was convinced that gays had an equivalent of a pontiff or prime minister who could speak on behalf of all of his people. All right, aside from just the funniness of the idea that there is apparently, according to this woman, a king of the gay men who is the leader and speaks for all of the gay men, this is what you start getting when you kind of start going down this intersectional rabbit hole, is you start getting this hierarchy of opinions, a hierarchy of people whose it eventually culminates in somebody being the head whatever, like the head black person or the head gay person or the head lesbian person, and whose opinions are sacrosanct. And that's not really a good place for anybody to be, but it does seem to be kind of the end game of intersectionality, at least as it's applied today. Now, going back to the piece, we're going to skip forward a little bit. If somebody is advocating policies for gay men to adopt, or for others to adopt towards gay men, what matters surely isn't whether the person is gay, but whether the policies are sensible. As a gay man, you can oppose same-sex marriage. It's just submitting to our culture's heteronormativity, and anyway, monogamy is a patriarchal invention. Or advocate same-sex marriage. It's an affirmation of equal dignity and a way to sustain gay couples. Because members of an identity group won't be identical, your as-a doesn't settle anything. The same holds for religious, vocational, and national identities. And, of course, for racial identities. In the 1990s, the black novelist Trey Ellis wrote a screenplay, The Inkwell, which drew on his childhood in the milieu of the black bourgeoisie. A white studio head, for whom race presumably eclipsed class, gave it to Matty Rich, a young black director who'd grown up in a New York City housing project. Mr. Rich apparently worried that the script wasn't black enough, and proposed turning the protagonist's father, a schoolteacher, into a garbage man. Suffice to say, it didn't end well. Are we really going to settle these perennial debates over authenticity with a flurry of as-a arrowheads? Now this touches on another part of intersectionality, which is authenticity, which now you have this kind of like authenticity Olympics, where it's like, okay, you're black, but, or you're gay, but, or you're lesbian, but, or you're disabled, but, and it's just this, it's this pylon of like, okay, well, how many labels do you have? Because I have 4, and so do you have 5? If you have 5, that means that you're more authentically oppressed than I am. And you see this happening. You see it happening every day in society. This idea that the more labels you have, the more authentic, the more real, the more important your opinions are in relationship to any other person who does not have as many labels or has the incorrect labels as opposed to you. And then the idea of black authenticity goes way past before we had intersectionality, and that's always been a touchy subject amongst the black community, is are you, quote unquote, black enough? Like, okay, you were born black, but you were born into a wealthy family, so you're not real, quote unquote. And so it feeds into that intersectionality. Like I said, it existed before the concept really became popular. But again, it's really just this weird thing. Like, I know I've discussed this before, but this whole idea of victimhood being some kind of badge of honor is just really fucking weird and fucked up to me. Like, how did we get here? But anyway, moving on. Going back to the piece. Somehow we can't stop trying. Ever since Donald Trump eked out his surprising electoral victory, political analysts have been looking for people to speak for the the supposedly disgruntled white working class voters who, switching from their former Democratic allegiances, gave Mr. Trump the edge. But about a third of working class whites voted for Hillary Clinton. Nobody explaining why white working class voters went for Mr. Trump would be speaking for the millions of white working class voters who didn't. One person could say that she spoke as a white working class woman in explaining why she voted for Mrs. Clinton, just as truthfully as her sister could make the claim in explaining her support for Mr. Trump, each teeing us up to think about how her class and race might figure into the story. No harm in that. Neither one, however, can accurately claim to speak for the white working class. Neither has an exclusive on being representative. The rise of intersectionality, to me, has kind of lent itself back into this idea that existed before intersectionality, and that is of trying to put people in these little boxes to try to understand them better. And so you see this a lot when everybody's trying to figure out, how did Trump win? Like, okay, if you really want to know why people voted for Trump, go fucking ask them. That's going to be the best way to find out. But instead of doing, like, the legwork on that, there's people who want to try to extrapolate based on race, based on gender, based on socioeconomic status. Like, why did these people vote for Trump and not Hillary? And it's like, you can't reduce people like that. You can't flatten them out to like this 2D thing of, okay, if you are X and Y, you should have voted for Z, and why didn't you vote for Z? I don't get it. Well, people are vast and contain multitudes, and there's lots of reasons why people do whatever it is they do, and intersectionality does not give any kind of freedom to understand people as individuals who have motivations that may be specific only to that person and may have nothing to do with their melanin level or their genitalia or their sexuality or their ability to do things or anything like that. So it's just it's intersectionality as this incredibly reductive thing. But one more point I want to make before we move from this over to the white guilt piece. It occurred to me while I was thinking about this that the whole as a trope is a way of, and I touched on this a little earlier, but this idea that when you use as a, you're trying to make it to where one person's opinion is either sacrosanct or it's garbage. Or basically you say as a, I don't know, let's, black, gender fluid, queer, poor person, my opinion is so much better and so much loftier and should be taken so much more seriously than a straight white male's. Because he's got, I don't know, some kind of privilege. We'll talk about that. But it really strikes me as this kind of like trying to put this little armor around yourself to where you think that nobody can question your opinion because you put all these little labels on yourself. And then you start from that basis of having all these little labels that you put on yourself and then voicing an opinion and then feeling like because you have your little labels that nobody can attack you or come at you about that opinion. It really just struck me like that may be where we're at with this. Like I think I figured out something when I was thinking about this. I think that's really it. But I want to go ahead and move on to the very sad, ridiculous, stupid, white guilt advice write-in letter thingamajigger. Now, just to kind of set this up, this is a letter that was written into the New York Times. There's apparently an advice column called The Sweet Spot, and I have seen it said online, and there seems to be some debate as to whether or not this letter is real or if this is somebody trolling. And honestly, I can't fucking tell. Like, I think we've reached peak Poe's Law because I genuinely, I don't know. Like, this could be trolling. This could be completely fucking serious. I honestly can't tell. So, let me go ahead and read it to you guys and see what you think. See if you are at the same spot I'm at. Letter starts out. Dear Sugars, I'm riddled with shame. White shame. This isn't helpful to me or to anybody, especially people of color. I feel like there is no me outside of my white, upper-middle-class, cisgender identity. I feel like my literal existence hurts people, like I'm always taking up space that should belong to somebody else. Alright, so basically this letter writer has no identity outside of her gender and her skin color and her socioeconomic status? What, is that it? You have no personality, no interior life, nothing else to add to the conversation, apparently, other than I am white and I am straight and I am upper middle class and I feel bad about it and I feel like I shouldn't exist. Which, oh my God. Let's keep going. I consider myself an ally. I research proper etiquette. What the fuck is proper etiquette for this? Right. I research proper etiquette, read writers of color, vote in a way that will not harm POC and other vulnerable people. What? How does one vote in such a way that you don't hurt people? I mean, outside of our bigger conversation about voting in the state and all of that, how do you vote to like not hurt people? Like, what? I don't get that. I engage in conversation about privilege with other white people. I wish someone would engage me in a conversation about privilege. I'm white. I don't have very much privilege. I wish somebody would have this conversation with me. That would be fun. I take courses that will further educate me. I donated to Black Lives Matter. I donated to Black Lives Matter. Like, is that like having the token black friend? Like, look, I'm not racist. I have a black friend. Look, I like people of color. I donated to Black Lives Matter. Like, what the hell? Are you serious? Like you see like how people could think this is trolling. But then again, this could also be dead ass serious. So, moving on. Yet I fear that nothing is enough. Part of my fear comes from the fact that privilege is invisible to itself. What if I'm doing or saying some insensitive things without realizing it? What? How? Ooh. You know what? If you don't want to be an asshole to people, just don't be an asshole to people. Like, you don't really have to, like, gender or race or sexual orient this. Just don't be a dick. There you go. I solved it for you. Don't be a dick. Can I get an advice column for the New York Times and get paid for doing this? Back to the letter. Another part of it is that I'm currently immersed in the whitest environment I've ever been in. My family has lived in the same apartment in East Harlem for 4 generations. Every school I attended, elementary through high school, was minority white, but I am now attending an elite private college that is 75% white. I know who I am, but I realize how people perceive me, and this perception feels unfair. I bet it does, because now you're starting to realize that people are frickin' jackasses out there in the world. But, like, okay, so if you've lived in East Harlem your whole life, you've been a minority white person, like, what? You would think that being immersed in a multicultural society would kind of inoculate somebody from this kind of stuff, like this idea of white privilege, but apparently not. It didn't stick with this one. I don't talk about my feelings because it's hard to justify doing so, while people of color are dying due to systematic racism, and making this conversation about me would be again centering whiteness. Again, this goes back to that idea that because you have these certain labels, you cannot voice your opinion because other people have better labels than you, and your labels are garbage, and so you should just shut the fuck up. I can't imagine internalizing a message like this. Like, I don't get it. I do not get it. Yet, bottling it up makes me feel an existential anger that I have a hard time channeling since I don't know my place. Ooh, that is a loaded statement. Don't ever use the statement, know your place, either in referring to yourself or to anybody else. Them's fighting words right there. Like, that's an insult. Don't ever tell somebody to know their place. Instead of harnessing my privilege for greater good, I'm curled up in a ball of shame. How can I be more than my heritage? Signed, Whitey. Like, you see where it would be very hard to tell if this is a troll job or if this is somebody being serious, because it could really go either way. I mean, intersectionality and the whole idea of white guilt and white shame has become such a fucking parody that you can't tell when things are parody anymore. So, whether or not that letter is fake or real, I don't know. What I do know is the responses to this letter are real, and as far as I'm concerned, they're the real story. So let's go ahead. This is actually two people that do this advice column. Steve Allman and Cheryl Strayed? Yeah, I butcher people's names. I'm sorry. But we're going to go ahead and start with Steve's response. Shame and anger are powerful emotions, Whitey. I'm going to have to come up with something other than to call, like, this letter writer, because I'm not going to make it through calling them Whitey. Because that sentence is just hilarious with it being addressed to Whitey. Anyway. And yet your central struggle is around identity. You write that you don't know your place. Again, told y'all about using that phrase. In fact, your letter describes your place as a kind of prison cell of privilege. What you really feel is trapped within an identity that makes you inescapably as an oppressor. Now, I already went off last week about my feelings about the oppressor-oppressed paradigm, which, TLDR, it's bullshit. Fucking bullshit. Doesn't exist. But, like, this is under the auspices of this being a real letter, writing to somebody for help in, like, figuring out how they can stop feeling guilty about being white. You fucking label them an oppressor? Really, dude? They're not helping. This is not helpful. Actually, none of this advice is helpful. None of it. But, going back to it. This feeling is especially acute right now, I suspect, because you're suddenly immersed in a milieu that reflects your privilege back to you. Huh? Okay, so she went from living in East Harlem her whole life to now being in a 75% white environment. How exactly is that supposed to mirror one's privilege back to them? I would think that that would be like the cozy home of white privilege. Like, being in a 75% white, elite, private institution would pretty much be like the home of white privilege, like where all the white privileged people would be. So this idea that it would somehow get mirrored back to you, I'm like, okay, no, that's weird. Moving on. We do live in a culture steeped in white supremacy and class bigotry, as well as patriarchal values. We do? It's news to me. I was not aware of this. Were you aware of it? Because I'm pretty sure we've already discussed this. But the solution to this injustice isn't to wallow in self-hatred. Instead, heed the words of the writer Bell Hooks. Privilege is not in and of itself bad. What matters is what we do with privilege, she writes. We have to share our resources and take direction about how to use our privilege in ways that empower those who lack it. You're not going to empower others by disempowering yourself. All right. A thought on that last sentence and on the whole idea of the last part of that piece of advice. Now, kind of to preface and kind of give you a spoiler alert of this going forward, both of these people seem to take a very Marxist view of intersectionality, in where the idea is that somehow through intersectionality, through labeling people, we will somehow get to this egalitarian society, which, if you think about it, that makes no sense whatsoever. Like, how is heaping labels on people going to get us to an egalitarian society? Like, that's not... You need to be doing the opposite if what you're wanting is equality, not making people, like, this stratosphere of equality and inequality and oppressor and oppressed based on these little labels that you keep putting on people. But the other thing about that is, much like most of Marxist thought, it encourages people to view life as a zero-sum game. Basically, if you have power, that means somebody else does not have power. So this idea that by empowering yourself, you're going to help empower others doesn't make any sense in that paradigm, because it's basically, if you're saying that you have power, you're an oppressor. And that means that somebody else, you have to be oppressing somebody, which means they don't have power. So how exactly are you going to fix that power imbalance while maintaining your power. Like, that doesn't make any sense. That doesn't make sense. All right, let's move on to Cheryl's response. I think Steve's onto something when he notes that your anxiety is acute now because the racial mix in your college is reflecting your privilege back to you, but I'll go even further. My hunch is that you're truly seeing it for the first time. You grew up in a neighborhood and attended schools where you were one of the relatively few whites. It's possible that your status as a situational racial minority gave you the illusion that you didn't have much in the way of racial privilege. What the fuck is a situational racial minority? All racial minorities are situational, dumbass. If I go to a Black Lives Matter rally, guess what? I'm going to be a situational racial minority because I'm probably going to be the only white person there. Like, all racial minorities and majorities are situational. Like, what the fuck? What is that? They're dumbass statements, man. They're stupid. Anyway, now that you're living in a community that, at 75% white, roughly mirrors that of the American population. Come on now. Stop it. That's the American population's not 75% white. Don't make up shit. Roughly mirrors half of the American population. You're feeling the full force of what it means to be white in a white supremacist culture, and it makes you feel uncomfortable because up until now, in some unconscious way, you exonerated yourself from it. You were the good white person because you grew up among people of color. Now you're another white face in the crowd at your elite college, and you're ashamed of it. Again, remember, this is supposed to be an advice column to help people who write in with problems. How the fuck is shaming somebody for growing up where they grow up and putting words in their mouth helping anybody? This is the worst advice column ever. This is not helpful. Oh my god, you basically just like slam this girl because she's the quote-unquote good white person who, because you know minorities, you think you're special. Like, go fuck yourself. Like, really? Like, what white-ass culture did these people grow up in? That's what I want to know. All these intersectional people, what white-ass culture did they grow up in? Okay, going back to the piece. It's Steve again, coming in, because apparently we couldn't just stop there. No, apparently got some more shit to say. As a straight white male raised by two professionals in an American suburb, I know I was born into a life of extraordinary privilege. But it wasn't always that way. It took me many years to begin to recognize these advantages as unearned, the product of corrupt systems stacked in my favor. Oh, gee, Steve. I'm sorry your parents, I don't know, went to work and got good jobs and moved out to the suburbs to try to give your happy ass a good life. This is somehow like some corrupt system that is stacking things in your favor as opposed to somebody else. Like, no. Your parents decided to give you a good life. That's not something to be, like, sad about or ashamed about. Like, that just is what it is. Your parents did what parents are supposed to do. I mean, gee, Steve, would you have been happier if you were born dirt fucking poor in the Appalachian Valley? Would that have made you happier? Probably not. Because you know what? Being dirt poor in the Appalachian Valley fucking sucks. So, shut up, Steve. But Steve doesn't shut up. Steve goes on. The rise of political actors and demagogues who promote white supremacy, misogyny, and racism is, in part, an effort by the privileged to reject these truths. They've created an ecstatic cult of victimization and recast the pursuit of justice as an assault on their selfhood. Now, Steve, let me explain something to you real quick. This is the game that you guys decided to play. This is the game that the leftists decided to make this cult of victimization thing happen. That by labeling yourself as this, that, or the other, you are a victim. Don't get pissed when all of a sudden white people want to appropriate that culture for themselves. You did this. You made this environment. So don't get pissy when other people start doing it. Because really, and I don't buy in the victimhood culture, but I get where certain people, certain white people, certain poor people feel this way in this current environment because of people like Steve. It's your fault, Steve. You did this. Moving on. But a nation founded on the ideal of equal opportunity will never fulfill its destiny unless those with power confront their privilege. Embrace that mission, and it may become easier to accept yourself as flawed but sacred. Excuse me? What? I'm sorry, she's flawed because of what now? Because of her skin color? Because of her gender? Because of her socioeconomic status? She's flawed? Wait a minute. That doesn't sound very nice. That sounds, a little bit racist, if you ask me. All of a sudden, you're flawed because you're not the right skin color and you were born in the wrong spot. All right, Steve. You can't change the story you were born into, Whitey. But you can be what Bell Hooks called a radical visionary who uses privilege to define and determine truly equitable standards. Seek out the causes and classes and candidates that speak to your vision of America. One in which the lives of the disenfranchised matter more than white people's feelings. Why the fuck, Steve, does anybody's feelings matter more so than anybody else's feelings? What the hell? See, this is why. The people at Trump rallies, do you want an explanation? Here it is, right fucking here. Telling people that because they are white, they don't matter as much as other people. This is the environment that these crazy ass intersectionalists, the Marxist intersectionalists, are creating, and it's coming back to bite them in the ass, and they seem to be very confused about it, but Steve's laying that out pretty well here. All right, Steve's almost done. Anguish is understandable in this age. Action is required. What action, Steve? I already told you all you have to do is just don't be an asshole. Like, that's it. That's all you gotta do. There's no other actions required. And here comes Cheryl again, because she can't just leave Steve's dumbassery lie. She's gotta follow up on it. You ask how you can be more than your heritage, Whitey. But what's... Again, stop calling her Whitey. Oh my god. You ask how you can be more than your heritage, Whitey, but what Steve and I are suggesting is that you need to own it first. As you seem well aware, your race granted you privileges that were and are denied to people who are not white. This is true for all white people in America, no matter how racially diverse their childhood neighborhoods were or were not, no matter how much money their families had or didn't have, no matter how difficult or easy their lives have been. Every white person should be ashamed of that injustice. Go fuck yourself. No. Being white, it's not the fucking golden ticket. Is there supposed to be like some white privilege card that I'm getting in the mail? Because I'm 37 years old and I ain't got it yet, and I'd really like to know when it's going to fucking be here. So this whole idea that you, like, all of a sudden because you're white, that's it. That's all that matters. That no matter what situation you were born into, no matter where you're from, no matter who you know, no matter where you grew up, all of a sudden, if you're white, your life is awesome, and you should feel bad about it. Which, what? Go fuck off with this. Get the fuck out of here. Really? Just no. You don't have to relinquish your heritage to be an ally to people of color, Whitey. I'm sorry, I'm going to laugh every time I say Whitey. You have to relinquish your privilege. And part of learning how to do that is accepting that feelings of shame, anger, and the sense that people are perceiving you in ways that you believe aren't accurate or fair are part of the process, and that you and I and all white people must endure it in order to dismantle a toxic system that has perpetrated white supremacy for centuries. No, I don't have to tolerate a goddamn thing. If somebody has a wrong perception of me, I will gladly correct it. I don't have to sit here and endure people freaking heaping criticism on me because I'm white. No. And if that's your idea of what being a white person is and that's what's expected of you, then again, you should not be surprised at what is going on in this country right now with white people. You're trying to make whiteness an identity, and it is going to come back. It's going to bite all of us on the ass. It's going to be ugly as fuck. Please stop doing it. Stop it. Stop trying to make white a thing. Moving back on, because this statement is hilarious. That, in fact, those painful and uncomfortable feelings are not the problem to be solved or the wounds to be tended to. Racism is. Remember last week when we talked about how people say that reverse racism can't exist or doesn't exist? This is pretty much making the argument that people can be racist against white people and just make snap assumptions on them based on their skin color, and that they should feel bad for being white, and that's all that matters about them is that they're white, and nothing else matters, and you don't need to know them as people. They're just white people, and white people are the devil, and that's it. which this is this very Marxist strain of intersectionality. And I want to emphasize that because I don't think everybody who buys into like this particular brand of it, but a lot of people do. And it's starting to manifest in very ugly ways in society. And it's funny because these are always the same people who want to bitch about ugliness on social media, on the internet, on people that go to Trump rallies, this, that, the other. But it's like this, you're creating the environment and these people are reacting to the environment you created. And so you can stop this. You can stop being this way. You can stop treating white people like this. And more than likely, this situation will dissipate. But no, you keep doubling down on it. And so it's just going to keep getting worse and worse and worse. So that's the end of this ridiculous white guilt nonsense. I wanted to do this one particularly just so I could talk about this particular strain of intersectionality and how it's really creating this very toxic environment. And also this is just gobbledygook. Like the whole thing, just front to back, is like word salad kind of. It's just, I don't know what these people are talking about. Like, no, just stop it. Just stop. All right, and before I leave off for today, I want to kind of give some of my thoughts on intersectionality as it is right now, which is that it's being presented as this idea of adding stuff to a person, but honestly, in my mind, it subtracts from people. Just each little label just takes something from somebody, just picks and picks and picks off little pieces of something, and all of a sudden you're labeled this gender, or you're labeled this race, or you're this sexuality, or you have these abilities and not those abilities. It's just so reductive until you get reduced down to this like little tiny bit of person that then gets slot into this one section. It's like, okay, you have these labels, so you should be like this, that, and the other. You should think XYZ. You should vote for this person. You should feel this way about this issue and that issue. And it doesn't take into account the fact that people are individuals. And as far as trying to move towards an egalitarian society, like I said, that is not going to get you there at all. In fact, all it's going to create is this incredibly stratified society of people who are on different levels of like the woke Olympics. Like you got, these people have got 2 labels, but these people have 3, these people have 4, these people up here have like 8, so they're like super special and they can't be touched. But it strikes me, it's just so anti-libertarian and so anti what we stand for as far as treating people as individuals and not treating people on the basis of your skin color or your gender or your sexuality or anything like that, and trying to meet people just as they are, regardless of any of that exterior bullshit that really you have no control over. Like you have no control. I mean, I guess you kind of have control over your gender now, but not really. But anyway, that's a whole nother topic for another day. But yeah, basically what I would like to see is just, like I said, like I always say, just treat people as individuals. Don't be an asshole. Like, you don't have to bend over backwards to treat somebody a certain way because you have a certain perception of people because of whatever label you're looking at. Like, oh, this person's black, so I have to treat them this way, or they're brown, or they're gay, or they're lesbian, or they're transgender, or they're gender fluid, or they're in a wheelchair, or they have crutches, or they're blind, or whatever. Just treat people with kindness and respect and dignity, no matter what other shit they may have going on. That's all you've got to do. Just be nice. Just don't be a dick. It's that simple. Just don't be a dick to anybody, and then you don't have to worry about whether you are insensitive or mean or hurt somebody's feelings because of whatever. And just stop labeling people. They mean nothing. It tells you nothing about a person. Knowing that somebody is a straight white male or a gay black man or a lesbian, transgender, brown person, it tells you nothing about the person. And it's incredibly reductive. And it's really, in a lot of ways, I think it is kind of racist and or sexist to kind of view people like that, because you're really just, you're coming up with a perception of somebody based on their race or their sex, and you're treating them a different way than you would treat other people. And I know that's not the technical definition of racism, but it's kind of like our cultural definition of racism right now. And it's just, it's ugly. it's ugly. Everybody is more than the sum of their parts. And if everybody could just kind of wrap their heads around that, and maybe just remember that, and understand that everybody has an interior life that you will never know about. Everybody is an individual with their own thoughts, their own opinions, that are not governed by any of their external shit that you can see when you're standing in line in Starbucks. And just try to bear in mind that, like I keep saying it, but everybody's an individual. Don't make assumptions about anybody based on external shit. That's all. Okay. I think I've said everything I wanted to say on this topic. If you do like this, please rate, comment, and subscribe. And thank you for making it this far, by the way. You can find me on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, and now also SoundCloud and Spotify. Take care, and until next time.